Once upon a time, there lived a girl who was so obsessed with popping pimples. Her name was Omotola, and she could not resist the sight of pimples on people's faces. Omotola felt a sense of unease whenever she came across a person whose pimples were ripe. Best believe that Omotola would stare at the person's face like a hawk, her fingers twitching with an uncontrollable urge to reach out and pop it. Her obsession began in secondary school when she accidentally popped a classmate pimple during prep. The satisfying splash, as she described it, gave her a thrill that she could not explain. From then on, Omotola became the pimple popper of her school. People joked about it. Some even came to her willingly, but not everyone appreciated her itchy fingers. As she grew older, Omotola's obsession became worse. She would stare intensely at strangers in buses, itching to ask them for permission to pop their pimples. Omotola watched several videos online where people popped the pimples of others. She felt a sense of calm whenever she watched these videos, and Omotola decided to feed her obsession. Days later, she secured a job at a nearby spa where she seized every opportunity to pop pimples. One day, a woman walked into the spa with flawless skin, except for a single ripe pimple on her face. It was swollen, red, and begging for relief, or so it seemed for Omotola. As the receptionist directed the woman to the facial treatment room, Omotola's eyes locked on the pimple like a sniper's scope. Her breathing changed, her fingers itched. She could barely hear the woman's name, Mrs. Ajayi, over the thudding in her chest. When Mrs. Ajayi lay on the table and closed her eyes for a deep cleansing session, Omotola took it as her moment. Ignoring the protocol and without asking for permission, she leaned in and gently pressed the pimple. It exploded satisfyingly, but Mrs. Ajayi screamed out in pain. She bolted upright, clutching her face as she yelled out angrily at her. Mrs. Ajayi was a rich businesswoman who turned out to be a big investor at the spa. The spa could not reach the wrath of someone so powerful. Within an hour, Omotola was summoned to the manager's office. The manager, a woman named Tokumbo, didn't mince her words.
Omotola, this is not your personal playground. This is a professional spa, and your conduct cannot be tolerated.
But it was just one pimple, Omotola replied the manager, who advised her to learn to keep her hands to herself. Omotola was fired on the spot. She left the spa in shame, unsure of what to tell her parents, who had warned her severally that her obsession would end up putting her into a lot of trouble. She arrived home and met her cousin Tayo, who made fun of her for what she did. Tayo was her favorite cousin, who spared no opportunity to tell her the truth. Omotola had used him severally to satisfy her obsession, and Tayo could not dare complain. He had endured her sneaky attacks when she'd lean over during discussions and squeeze a bump on his chin or pretend to hug him just to press the pimple on his cheek. He hated it so much, but Omotola always smiled afterwards like she had just saved the world. One day, Tayo warned, "You popped the wrong pimple and it won't end well." Omotola laughed it off, even as she sulked about losing her job. She needed something, anything, to calm the growing itch in her fingers. 2 days later, while running an errand at the busy market, she spotted him, a tall, dark-skinned man, dressed in a white kaftan that looked like it had not been washed in years. His face was riddled with pimples, massive bulging pimples. It was like a buffet of temptation laid out before her eyes. He stood alone near a corner, unmoving, staring blankly ahead like he was lost or waiting. The crowd moved around him, but no one seemed to pay him any form of attention. Omotola's heart raced. Her mouth went dry as her fingers tingled. "Just one, only one," she whispered to herself, and without thinking or asking for permission, she walked up to the man, raised her hand and pressed her thumb gently into the largest pimple on his cheek. Pop! It went as the pus shot out with a quiet hiss, but instead of feeling the usual rush of relief, Omotola suddenly felt cold, extremely cold. The man's eyes turned to her, and for the first time she noticed that they were completely white, no pupils, no blink, no life. Then, right before her eyes, he vanished. One second he was there, and the next gone like smoke, like dust in the wind. Omotola screamed out in terror as the market women all turned to her startled. They wondered why she was screaming, and Omotola tried to explain to them that the strange man had disappeared, but no one seemed to have seen him except her. She ran home breathless, drenched in fear, as she sat on her bed unable to sleep. That night was the longest night of her life. Sleep eluded her as the events of that evening replayed in her mind. Her fingers burned and began to itch. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw the lifeless face of the strange man. By morning, her fingers had grown 3 times its normal size, and the itch was now becoming unbearable. Omotola applied several ointments to her hand, hoping that the itch would subside, but it never did. Rather, a huge eye grew out from the center of her palm, and Omotola let out a loud scream. She was so terrified and did not know what to do. The eye on her palm blinked, and when it did, Omotola could make pimples appear on people's faces. It was terrifying. Where once she sought out pimples, now pimples began to appear because of her. She walked past a woman with flawless skin, and within seconds, huge pimples grew out of her cheeks. Even a group of teenagers who laughed at her swollen hand grew pimples on their faces in a split second. Pimples were now everywhere, and Omotola, who was once obsessed with them, could no longer stand their sight. She locked herself up in her room, unsure of what to do with the hand. Her cousin Tayo began to grow worried. He hadn't seen Omotola in 2 days. No calls, no messages, and her bedroom light stayed on all night. By the 3rd day, he could not take it anymore. He knocked on her door, calling out her name repeatedly. "It's me, Omotola. Open the door," he said continuously, but Omotola ignored him completely. She could not risk anything happening to him and decided to keep away, but Tayo was not one to back down. With a heavy push, he knocked down the door and met Omotola, who was crouched in the corner of her room, drenched in her own sweat. "No, Tayo, you can't be here. Take your eyes away," she said to Tayo, who stood there confused as he caught sight of the strange eye. Immediately, huge pimples began to pop up on his face. It was so huge and painful, and Tayo could not help but scream. He ran out of the room terrified as Omotola wept bitterly to see him in such pain. Days passed, and Tayo became terribly ill. Huge pimples overshadowed his face, and his body temperature rose to a dangerous level. Tayo could not eat, sleep, and his face was swollen beyond recognition, covered in strange pimples. His mother rushed him to the hospital, but the doctors could not understand what was happening. No medication worked, and no diagnosis made sense. Tayo was dying, and Omotola knew that she was behind it all. She wore a black glove on her hand to cover the strange eye, unable to stand what she had become. Omotola decided to find out what had happened to her. She had to get a solution to her problem before anything bad happens to her cousin Tayo. So, she snuck out of her house, her palm covered in a glove, as she went out in search of help. Omotola had no idea where she was going. She wandered the streets alone, moving from one end of the city to the other. She was so exhausted. She sat by the side of the road tired as she tried to rest her legs. A huge dog then rushed towards her and began to bark. Omotola had not been this terrified in her entire life. She watched as the dog defecated in front of her. Omotola could not hide her disgust. She stood up from the side of the road and continued to walk, hoping to find anyone who might have a solution to her problem. She decided to head to the market, where she last saw the strange man. Omotola sat in the corner, close to where she was standing on that fateful day. She was so exhausted and fell into a very deep sleep. By the time she woke up, it was already night, and all the market stalls had already closed. Omotola could not understand how she slept so deeply. She got up from the ground terrified as she decided to make her way back home. Just as she turned to leave the market, she saw an old woman who was going through the trash in the market crying. She looked hungry as she picked up a moldy bread from the trash and began to eat. Omotola caught sight of her from a distance. She approached the old woman to ask if she was fine. "Are you okay, ma?" she asked softly as the old woman looked up and stared at her hand. "You carry the eye," she whispered as Omotola froze in shock. "You know about it?" Omotola asked the old woman, who nodded and walked closer to her and began to speak. "The eye came to you because you disrespected the dead. You touched what should never have been touched." Omotola's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't know. I didn't mean to, please. My cousin is dying and everyone I pass falls sick." The old woman leaned forward, her voice now barely above a whisper. "You're being followed," she said to Omotola, who she advised to follow her home. "I have a solution for you," she said to Omotola, who was so delighted to hear it. She followed the old woman, who took her to a small house not too far from the market. Omotola followed the old woman into the house. "You must be thirsty," she said to Omotola as she handed her a cup of water to drink. Hours passed and Omotola woke up to find herself asleep in the house. Next to her was the old woman, who was now lying on the floor dead with a knife in her hand. The glove on her hand had been removed and the eye blinked at her as she screamed. Omotola in that moment realized that the old woman had not meant well for her. She wanted to steal the eye from her palm, but the eye struck her dead on the spot. Omotola ran out of the house terrified. She could not imagine what her obsession for bursting pimples had led her into. She arrived at her house and locked herself up in her room. Shaking, she removed the glove from her hand and began to yell angrily at the strange eye. "Leave me alone," she said, apologizing to the eye for ever touching the face of the dead man. Omotola was so frustrated. She received a call from Tayo's sister, who called to inform her that her cousin Tayo was dead. Omotola could not believe her ears. She sat on her bed, weeping as she blamed herself for the death of Tayo. The pain was too much to bear. She held her cursed palm to her chest, screaming until her voice cracked. The eyes blinked slowly, almost mockingly, as though it was feeding on her sorrow. "You took him," she wailed. "You killed Tayo." But the eye did not stop. It twitched, then opened wider, glowing a faint red. It was growing again, expanding across her hand like a web of veins. She felt the itch returning, stronger, deeper, spreading through her arm like fire. And then it spoke, not loud, but inside her. A slithering voice in her mind. "One life for one life. He was the price. You knew this the moment you touched the dead." Omotola screamed out in pain. "I didn't know anything. Just leave us alone. I've apologized for touching your face. Leave me and my family alone," she said angrily as she smashed her hand on the wall, hoping to smash the eye. But nothing happened to the eye. Rather, the wall caved in a little, intensifying her frustration. Omotola had to get rid of the eye. She decided to cut off her wrist, believing that living without a wrist would be a better punishment than living with the evil eye on her palm. So, she walked into her bathroom and picked up a knife when suddenly she heard some strange noises by her window. Omotola walked out of her house to see what was happening when she came across another strange dog defecating by her window. Filled with so much rage, she picked up the poop to throw at the dog when suddenly she noticed something strange. The moment the dog's poop touched her palm, the strange eye sizzled like oil in fire. Omotola gasped. She dropped the poop and stared in disbelief as smoke rose from her palm. The eye blinked wildly, not in power this time but in panic. It was dissolving. The black vein shrank and then a voice returned, but this time it was desperate. "No, not the filth. The filth defiles me." Omotola's lips trembled as she bent down quickly, scooped more of the poop and smeared it across her palm. It was disgusting, humiliating, but she didn't care. Not anymore. The eye screamed, not in sound but in a pulsing, written agony that made her entire arm shake. Black pus oozed from her wrist and the ground beneath her shook violently. Omotola screamed too, half in pain, half in triumph, as the eye began to melt, collapsing into her skin like candle wax on fire. The voice shrieked one final time. "You filthy girl, you don't deserve my power." And then, silence. The eye was gone. Her palm was whole, smooth, normal. No veins, no itch, no curse. Omotola collapsed onto the grass, sobbing, laughing and shaking. It was over. It was finally over. And although Omotola was so excited to be free, she regretted what she did, knowing that her carelessness cost her the life of her beloved cousin Tayo. She sat there for hours, under the night sky, with her once cursed hand resting gently on her lap. A breeze passed, a soft calm breeze, and for a moment, Omotola thought that she heard Tayo's laughter, gentle, teasing like he always did when they were together. She smiled through the tears and apologized to him. "I'm sorry, Tayo," she whispered. "You warned me and I didn't listen. I've learnt my lesson, Tayo. But what hurts is that I learnt it in a very painful way." From that day on, Omotola never popped pimples again. The lesson to be learned from this story is that you should learn to respect the boundaries of others. Never let your obsession override your wisdom. What starts off as a harmless habit can become a dangerous addiction when it's left unchecked. Omotola's story is a painful reminder that not every desire deserves to be satisfied and not every impulse should be followed. I hope you enjoyed the story.